Right, welcome everyone. And if for those of you that have never been to a book talk, welcome to you, special welcome. My name is Michelle Stover and I am the director of our library, and this is Tisha Wu. She's our user services librarian. Yes, right. Our author today is the Reverend Dr. AnneMarie Mingo. She will be leading a conversation about her book, Have You Got Good Religion? Black Women's Faith, Courage, and Moral Imagination in the Civil Rights Movement, published by University of Illinois Press. Dr. AnneMarie Mingo is the Associate Professor of Ethics, Culture, I'm not speaking very well today. The Associate Professor of Ethics, Culture, and Moral Leadership, and the Director of the Metro Urban Institute at the seminary, and these are positions that she has held since 2022. She is a member of the American Academy of Religion, where she serves on a steering committee for womanist approaches to religion and society. She is also a member of the Society of Christian Ethics. Dr. Mingo has written articles for many publications, including Journal of Feminist Studies in Religion, Journal of Religious Ethics, and Black Theology, an international journal. She is also a book series editor for T&T Clark Studies in Social Ethics, Ethnography, and Theologies. Have You Got Good Religion? Black Women's Faith, Courage, and Moral Imagination in the Civil Rights Movement is her first monograph, too. So, Dr. Mingo also, she received her MDiv at Princeton Theological Seminary, where in 2006 she received the Jean Ann Swope and James L. Mecham Prize in Christian Ethics. She received her PhD in Religion, Ethics, and Society from Emory University and is an ordained itinerant elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. So, before we start, I have just a few housekeeping matters. First, we will be posting links to bookshop.org as well as Amazon so that you can purchase her book. I believe you're going to we're also going to put the link to your website. Yes, yeah. So those will all be posted, if they're not already, in chat for those of you online. And of course, those of you who are local can come to Barbara Library and check out the book if you have a library account. So this is my pitch for signing up for one. If you don't, all are welcome to sign up for a library account. Also, we're going to be posting a link to an online subject guide developed for this book talk, which includes books, journal articles, and websites that will help you explore this and related topics. This excellent guide was created by Tisha. There is also a curated display of books upstairs that you can peruse after the book talk, for those of you here, as well as a bibliography of these books that you can take home with you, which is on the back table back there. So, yeah. For those of you online, this bibliography is available in the subject guide, and for those of you interested in more information about about AnneMarie Mingo, links to her faculty page will also be provided. Yeah, that's a lot of links. Please also be aware that this book talk will be recorded and then posted in a couple of places. We will provide links for these at the end after the book talk. You may want to view the live transcription during the book talk for those of you who are online, which you can see by clicking the live transcription button at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions that you would like to ask, we invite you to do so at the appropriate time. And lastly, I'd like to thank our communication staff who help us with advertising and registration. And I'd also like to thank Bobby Darcelik for being our book talk ever helpful tech support person. And finally, thanks to Tisha Wu for creating wonderful educational resources as well as setting up this event. So, and now I'll turn it over to Dr. Mingo.
evening, everybody. How does my sound? All right. Thank you to Michelle and to Tisha and to Bobby and to all of you who have gathered tonight, both here in person, and hello to everybody online. I'm looking forward to this talk. I've been able to share quite a bit about the book, even though it's only about 2 weeks old in the real land. As far as the book launch, the official pub date was on March 26th. So you all are still pretty early in this, but I've been talking and sharing about the book since January. So it's great to be now in my home institution to share a little bit more about Have You Got Good Religion, Black women's faith, courage, and moral leadership in the civil rights movement. So for those of you who are hanging out in the back, just like we would say in church, we've got some wonderful seats up front. Feel free to come on in. You'll also notice, at least for those of you who have made it here physically, I've got a lovely bookmark in each of your seats for you to be able to take with you as a reminder about this talk, a reminder about the book, and a way to encourage others to also support. So let's hop right on in. I'm going to do my best to keep this within an hour time frame, inclusive of questions, primarily because I have to teach tonight. Okay? Okay. So as I introduce my book, I tell a story of George Calvin Best Jr., whose body was found in a creek in West Point, Mississippi on August 6, 1967. The official report indicated that at 6 feet tall, he had accidentally drowned in a mere 3 feet of water. Calvin, as he was known, left Tallahassee, Florida in the summer of 1967 to participate in voter registration activities with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, better known as SNCC, throughout the South. He went missing, and my mother recalls, quote, everybody was scared to say anything or ask anything. You just didn't know anything. As I grew up, my mother, Cynthia Mingo, often recounted the story of Calvin's death, and it always troubled me. How could someone 6 feet tall drown in 3 feet of water? They had grown up together doing Easter speeches and Christmas speeches at their church. Calvin and my mother had been influenced by the same Sunday school teacher, Daisy O. Young, and the same pastor, Reverend King Solomon DuPont, who helped to organize carpools there in Tallahassee, Florida. We often don't talk about the bus boycott in Tallahassee. We normally only talk about Montgomery, but Tallahassee, Baton Rouge, and Montgomery were significant in the civil rights movement for bus boycotts. Their pastor, Reverend King Solomon DuPont, declared, quote, that he would rather die and go to hell before ride the bus again. That's how dedicated he was to changing the system. Calvin's death was a reminder of the dangers associated with organizing. And though it was a reminder, it was not a deterrent to my mother and countless of other women like her who decided to try to change things. My mother and others like her from even my home community are the reason that I do the work that I do today as a scholar of the civil rights movement. The stories like the one of Calvin Best captivated me the most as a child. They were, these things that were happening in my home state's capital, Tallahassee. My mother was facing the realities of Jim and Jane Crow on a daily basis right there in the state capitol. She would explain how when riding a bus, they would have to pay their money in the front and then hope to get to the back in time before the bus sped off. She would describe to me how they would try to go shopping in department stores such as Lerner shops, but they were prevented from trying on clothing to see if it would actually fit. They were prevented from trying on shoes. There are some stories where people would actually try to trace out the size of their foot on a piece of paper and put the shoe on top of that to get as close as possible because they were not allowed to try on shoes. My mom would describe how Black people in her community, in her neighborhood, were required to stand and eat at this area in the back of the restaurant, despite paying the same amount for the food that the white patrons who were able to sit in the front at nice tables with nice tablecloths were able to do. It reminded me and made me know at a very early age that their green money did not eclipse their sun-kissed skin. My mother shared stories of these daily discriminations so that my brother and I could better understand and appreciate our ways of being in relation to my parents' relatively recent past. There are a number of early impacts that show up and influences that show up around the civil rights movement as it relates to this work. In her early teens, as I described, my mother watched the adults in her community, including my grandfather, participate in these bus boycotts that were organized by Reverend Charles Kinsey Steele, who was the pastor of Bethel Baptist Church in Tallahassee, and Mr. Sam Johnson, who was the Sunday school superintendent at her church. They created this transportation network that allowed an 8-month bus boycott to take place from 1956 to 1957. My mother also listened to students at Florida A&M University as they were actively working to change things and push against unjust systems of segregation by boycotting and protesting and marching. And so in this image, you'll see some students from Florida A&M University who are protesting there in Tallahassee, downtown. There were mass meetings that were taking place in her home congregation of Fountain Chapel AME Church, again pastored by Reverend King Solomon DuPont. I just love saying his name, King Solomon. Can you imagine? He went by KS, but the name was King Solomon. Those things reinforced her to do what she felt that she had to do whenever the time came to try to help thwart segregation, even if it meant risking physical violence. And so after nearly 80 years of the degradation of Jim and Jane Crow, the time for action had become now, and the seeds of justice that had been planted by those church communities and planted by her local community were beginning to grow. Now, one of the other things, that story of Calvin Bess always stuck with me, but it also this thing would also stick in my mind that, wait a minute, but my mom protested. Nobody knows, my mom protested, she sat in. And one of the things that is also, it was always, a little, I don't know about this, because my grandmother told them not to go. My grandmother told my aunt Eunice and my mom to not go and protest. She was not going to have it. She didn't want them embarrassing the family. She didn't want something happening, so she forbade them to go. But they went and protested anyway. And my grandmother was strict. And some people say she didn't play the radio. She did not play. And yet they went anyway. And it always bugged me, like, why would they risk the potential retaliation of the white people that did not want them there sitting in and protesting, but even potentially worse retaliation from my grandmother if they got home? Because what my mom would describe is that she and her sister Eunice spent more time looking over their shoulder trying to make sure that none of the neighbors saw them, because they were afraid that a neighbor might be in that store shopping, see them there sitting in, and tell my grandmother before they got home. And yet they did it anyway. Almost 30 years after learning the story of Calvin, who I consider a martyr of the civil rights movement, and my mother and her sister Eunice, that had been shaped by this AME pastor in Tallahassee, Florida, I found myself in the presence of another AME woman in Atlanta. And her experiences and her descriptions confirmed something for me. Her name was Rosa Brown, and I grew to call her Nana Rosa. She was an octogenarian at Big Bethel AME Church at the time that I began having my discussions with her. When I first met her, she began to describe these experiences there in Atlanta when she was working at Atlanta Life Insurance Company, which was a Black-owned company that serviced the community in ways that white companies would not. She described to me that her husband was one of just a handful of Black men that were working at the U.S. postal system at that time, at the actual main post office as one of the carriers. Nana Rosa would describe to me how women that worked with her at Atlanta Life, this Black-owned insurance company, would take their lunch break and go down to the U.S. post office, the main post office, and protest in front of it. And here I am writing my notes. I'm doing ethnography, I'm doing oral histories, I'm writing these notes. And it hit me, wait a minute. Were you protesting outside of the post office at the same time that your husband is one of only a handful of Black men working there? I asked her, and she said it was bigger than that. And that was the aha moment for me, that there were people committed to doing this work that were not as concerned about personal retaliation. They were not as concerned about even reprisals against their spouses. They wanted to make things better for those of us that were yet to come. So the church women that I learned from were not focused on individual success or achievement, but the moral transformation of the whole society. For them, the struggle for freedom and justice was not going to be deterred by disapproving parents or silenced by the face of possible reprisals. For these women, it was bigger than themselves, and I wanted to know why. So normally, when I'm talking with folks, especially younger folks, and we'll see how you all do, I begin asking questions around, so I want you to name some leaders from the civil rights movement. So name some leaders. Who do you think the first person I hear?
Martin Luther King.
Martin Luther King, Martin Luther King Jr., all of those pieces, same person. Yes.
John Lewis.
Who do you think, okay, we got John Lewis. Who do you think normally the second person is that I hear?
Rosa Parks.
Second person is normally Rosa Parks. Normally the first person that someone names is Martin Luther King Jr., King, Martin Luther King, whatever portion of it. They rarely put Reverend. They only sometimes put doctor. That's another story. And then the second person that is often lifted up is Rosa Parks. But if you look at any of the images during the civil rights movement, you see all of these people. I wanted to know, who are they? We know the Kings. We know the John Lewises. We know the Rosa Parks. We might even know the Fannie Lou Hamers. But if you look at any of the images, you don't see a single person, a singular person that makes up a movement. A movement is made up of the masses. And I wanted to know, well, who are those other people? Because so many of them were women as I looked at pictures. Who are they? Why are they out there? What took them there and what kept them there? I wanted to know. I had this feeling that a part of what was taking them there was an aspect of their understanding of God. Part of what was keeping them there was an aspect of their understanding of things that they had to do. So I was trying to understand, how does their theology connect to their ethics? How is it that their understanding of God is pushing and promoting them to do something, their ethics? And so that began the work that I started doing. So there is a legacy of self-determination that exists within the Black community. The civil rights movement was more than a fight for a bus seat or a hamburger at a lunch counter, and it was more than the backdrop of an inspiring song. The civil rights movement was not simply a social movement, it was not simply a political movement, it was a spiritual movement. It has roots within the ongoing legacy of freedom struggles within the United States. There were a lot of unknowns at the beginning of the civil rights movement in the mid-20th century, but there was a common hope and a desire for freedom that motivated many Black people to fight for the right to live their lives without socially constructed limitations. The participants in the civil rights movement, as I've been able to discuss things with them, they believed that their actions were going to be on the right side of history, whether their names were recorded in the history books or not. So for them, this was not a popularity contest or a quest to get the superlative of most likely to be arrested or anything else, right? Success was not promised to them. But the momentum of the movement grew individual acts of resistance and helped them to find common ground in the actions of others. Change began to be felt in the air. It began to be something that just kept popping up around them. And many of the women decided that this was work that they were also going to join. Throughout my book, I use a term, everyday women, a lot. Because again, if you think about any of those images, generally that you would see during the civil rights movement, still images or even video, you see a bunch of women and they are not working for the NAACP. They are not working for CORE. They are not working for SNCC. They are not working for the NCNW. They are simply women who decide that change is necessary. So that it was interesting to me because they did not have the protection of working for those organizations. They could have easily been fired, and yet they went. And so these everyday women, the women that you could walk past as you're going in the grocery store, the women who you might be seated next to on a bus, they were the ones that helped change our nation. And for me, that's extremely important for us to not only know at that past moment, but to think about today, because we too can do the same thing. I also use the term churchwomen as a marker for these women and girls who were often barred from formal church leadership and theological study. Yet through their experiences with God, they constructed a lived theological expression of liberation during the time that a group of Black churchmen were writing about liberation theology on behalf of Black people, often without the involvement of women. And so they use the term and moniker church men for themselves, and so I use the term and moniker church women for these women. There was also this great influence of the Black church that was happening. And since its beginning, socio-religious activism has been a part of the core reason for the existence of the Black church in the United States. Socio-religious activism reflects a belief that the religious practitioners have social responsibilities to act in ways that reflect and reinforce the love and justice modeled by their God. For movement participants, the religious aspect of activism is a part of a spiritual ethos that is at the very heart of their being. This spiritual sense is central to an African-centered notion of religion. And as a result, socio-religious activism permeates throughout areas of health, politics, and other areas that are not limited to a particular denomination or faith tradition. Such activism indicates a conscious commitment to action, not a passivity or blind agreement. This is a conscious choice that they are making, believing this is a part of their faith. Socio-religious activism means acting in a way that challenges injustice deliberately and forthrightly. So you'll see in this image, anybody know who this is? Wyatt?
Where was it taken?
It doesn't matter, because where it's taken is not where he pastored.
Okay.
So anyway, that's Wyatt T. Walker. So this actually takes place in Atlanta. But you'll notice here in those images, what do you see? A lot of women. A lot of women. So who were they? They were drawn into these spaces that created a form of safety for them because it was a Black-owned space of the church, which is why so many of those mass meetings were taking place there. But this also was a place where they could get the encouragement that they needed to go to the next day. One of the things that was also often interesting to me when I started digging into the civil rights movement a lot more is I was trying to understand how did people sustain what it was that they were doing. We have the benefit in 2024 of knowing what the end result was going to be of the civil rights movement. They didn't have that. This was a day-to-day choice to keep going out there. When you think back to Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, we know that she has had an encounter with that same bus driver almost a decade before. We know, now those of us who read and study, that she had already been training and studying and preparing at the Highlander Folk Center. We know that she was trained as a nonviolent activist. She wasn't simply tired on that day. We know that she had been working for the NAACP for years. We know that she had been helping to lead the youth council for the NAACP there in Montgomery. She was not simply tired. But on that day, December 1st, 1955, when she has this encounter with this bus driver that she'd already had an encounter with before, she does remain seated and is arrested as a result of that. We've got the support of the Women's Political Council, which was already in existence in Montgomery, who had already been planning for a bus boycott, who could capitalize on that and act immediately. That's how we get this action, because they had already been working. December 1st, she's arrested. December 5th, 1955, they begin their one-day bus boycott. They do it on that day because that was her court date. So they said, we're going to support Miss Rosa. Everybody loved Miss Rosa. The community knew Miss Rosa. We're going to support Miss Rosa. And we're going to stay off the bus on her court day. That one-day bus boycott becomes a 381-day bus boycott. How do you do that without having your faith? Without having the influence of the church? Without having a place to come to week after week to be reminded of what you're doing and why you're doing it, and that God is with you. So there was a significant influence of the Black church. I want to take a moment as I watch my time to introduce you briefly to a couple of the women that I feature within the book. So within my book, I have moral exemplars that show up at the end of each of the chapters. I'm an ethicist, so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you some people that you can look to as models, as moral models. And those are a little bit more well-known women. Some of them are not so well-known, but a little bit more well-known. And then within each of the chapters, I do this introductory area, but then I begin to work through some virtue ethics that I generate coming out of the lived experiences of these women. And so when you think through the actual title of the book, you'll see those ethics popping up. Black women's faith, first ethic, freedom faith. Courage, second ethic, courageous resistance. And moral leadership in the title. That's because the publisher didn't like my theomoral imagination. They thought it was too long. But theomoral imagination is the third of those virtue ethics, okay? And so as I'm walking through each of those, I was using, and these might become questions for later. I don't know. I figure I'll just go ahead and drop a few things now. I used a number of things as an ethnographer and as a person that was doing oral history, et cetera, to try to better understand these women. But it was important for me to not go in with a theory to fit them into. So I used grounded theory. And I took everything from those interviews, did all of the transcriptions, analyzed those to figure out what's their language. What is it that they are saying? What is it that they are doing? If no one had ever talked to them, how in the world could I know what they thought about God? How could I know what they thought about their actions? And so I want to introduce you to a couple of the women that I feature more prominently within these everyday women. There are 8 that feature prominently within the historic civil rights movement time period. Then by the end of the book, I create this theology of movements as we think through social movements today. And I lift up 4 contemporary women who are now movement leaders, movement pastors. And so we'll work through that in just a moment. So the first woman I want to introduce you to is Rose Schofield. Rose Davis Schofield was raised in Elizabeth, New Jersey, and it was there that her activism took place as a member of Mount Teman AME Church. Although not supported, actually, by the women in her family, Schofield's grandfather supported her participation in protests that were arranged by her church and the local NAACP chapter. She recalls seeing in Elizabeth, New Jersey, whites-only signs and other blatant discrimination practices, especially around labor practices, that were deeply embedded in her city. As a teenager, Rose believed what her pastor, Reverend Watts, would say as he taught and preached. He taught them that any exclusions or limitations based on race were not right, and they should be actively fought against. But he also stressed that it wasn't simply for them to leave that up to God, that they were going to need to do some work to help themselves. So Rose took those lessons from her pastor to heart and looked for ways to actively challenge the injustices that were brought to her attention in those mass meetings sitting there at Mount Teman AME Church in Elizabeth, New Jersey. And so when the jails began to fill up in New Jersey, we often think about for those who study the civil rights movement, we think through the filling up of jail strategy that was happening in the South. And then once those are being filled, the young people are going in and all of this. Similar things were happening in the North. The local NAACP chapter, as those jails began filling up with adults, they turned to children or young people as a part of their strategy to overcrowd those facilities. Rose's grandfather gave her formal permission to participate in NAACP activities because he signed a consent form for her because of her age. Rose ultimately was arrested in August of 1963 for chaining herself together with other young people in the middle of an active street in Elizabeth, New Jersey, to bring attention to the need for systemic changes in the racially biased city and county construction contract bidding processes. When it was time for her to get released from jail, the grandfather didn't know which jail she was in, and they didn't have a car, they didn't have those kind of resources. So he walked all throughout the city of New Jersey, of Elizabeth, from jail to find her. But you'll see this picture, this is Rose. So this is actually one of the articles that she is captured in when I was interviewing her. She's still a member of Big Bethel AME Church in Atlanta, Georgia. And as I was doing the interview, she said, well, there's a picture of me somewhere. I mean, I was protesting. We were chained. She just talked. We were just chained up. We were in the middle of the street. I don't know. There's a picture of me somewhere in the newspaper. I'm like, ma'am, seriously? She's like, yeah, there was a big dump truck and it was coming. It's about to run over us. But, we just, are you serious? So then I decide I got to find this. So I go to Elizabeth, New Jersey. I'm in their public library going through the microfilm, microfiche, because I have a general idea of at least a year. And then she was like, well, we were out of school, so I read it's at least the summer, right? So I'm going thing after thing after thing. I finally find some stuff. But as I'm looking, I start seeing this name that keeps popping up as the president of the Elizabeth, New Jersey NAACP chapter. So I call my parents. And I was like, Mom, did Mr. Kennedy ever live in New Jersey? I thought he lived in Philly. Come to find out, the person who was the president of the NAACP chapter during all of these protests was a member of my home church in Gainesville, Florida at this point. He had retired down there. And I knew that he was from the Northeast, but in my mind, I thought Philly. But I keep seeing Francis Kennedy is a pretty particular name for a black person, right? And so I keep seeing this thing, and I'm going through all of these old newspaper articles, and I realize, oh my goodness, this is the same person, which gave me even greater insights. Because I don't know if the question popped up for you, but it popped up for me. Why would a grandfather have to fill out a consent form? I was able to ask the president who created the consent forms. They wanted to ensure that they could not be told that they were coercing the students to do that. So they had these documents for anybody that was participating because they knew that those were the strategies that were going to be happening. Right? Wow. I love it. I love it. So Rose also had quite a bit of support from her grandfather. And so she, shortly after being arrested, she wants to go and participate in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, which also happens in August of 1963. But her mom, her aunt, her grandmother, they all said no. But the grandfather said, no, I think she should go. She begins to describe this debate that happens in her household. She says, I was 16, and my aunt said, no, I couldn't go. They would never let me go anywhere. And then my grandfather happened to say, well, I think she should go. I think it would be a good experience. And they said, well, she's 16. She'll be down there by herself. Somehow, my grandfather dug up the money, and I wound up on the bus. And he knew these people because it was going from some bar that had gotten up a busload of people, and they told him, we'll look out for her. So Rose's grandfather knew some people that were going to take a bus from a bar in Roselle, New Jersey. And this 16-year-old, without any other family, without any other people that she knew, makes her way onto this bus with this ticket that her grandfather had purchased, and they go from New Jersey down to Washington, D.C. She describes how she knew it was a powerful moment, an important moment that she wanted to be present for. And she also describes that, she said that they didn't have a lot of resources, so she didn't have her own camera. Most people didn't at the time. So she says, I got really close. She kept making her way towards the front, towards the stage, and she was by herself. And she says, I think people thought I was trying to get back to my parents, so they just let me keep going through. So she kept pressing her way to get towards the front of the gathering. And then she made her way back to New Jersey. No one bothered her. There was no issue. This was a collective group of people who were trying to make a change, and she believed that her presence was going to count for something. So that's Rose David Schofield. I'll introduce real quickly another one of the women. So another one of the women that I learned from is Bessie Smith Sellaway. When I checked my voicemail one evening as I was starting to do some of this research, I used 4 churches, and perhaps we can talk through that in the Q&A. And I would have these announcements in the church bulletin and with my info and all of that stuff. And so listening to a voicemail one day, and I hear, this is Bessie Smith Sellaway. I'm just an old jailbird. I was like, who is this lady? I need to talk to her, I'm just an old jailbird. And so I definitely wanted to interview her as a part of this work. I found out in this interview that she was born in Round Oak, Georgia, which is near Macon. She lived with her grandmother for a while, and even at a young age, she began to see the distinctions between the treatments of white people and black people, because she would have to walk many, many miles to school. And she walked actually 7 miles each way to kindergarten. As a bus would drive by with white students. And so when the time became available, she was able to move to Atlanta, where her mother had already moved after the death of her father, because she was looking for more economic opportunities. And so Miss Bessie grows up pretty much in the 4th Ward of Atlanta. That's the area where Auburn Avenue is and a number of other historic spaces within the Black community. She talks about how her grandmother taught her to know God for herself and encouraged her to always tell the truth. And she talks about her grandmother's influence on her, even as a young child, as the genesis for her activism. She grew up spiritually in Lindsay Street Baptist Church under the leadership of Reverend H.W. Alexander, and she often attended meetings, mass meetings at Ebenezer Baptist Church, where Martin Luther King Jr. and his brother A.D. King would provide strategies to test the laws of segregation by targeting actions at businesses that they were seeking to integrate downtown. She also remembers, though, Martin Luther King Jr. stressing that if you can't be nonviolent, you need to figure out something else. Don't come out here if you can't be nonviolent. He would say you can participate by praying, by raising money, by comforting people, or something else. But if you can't commit to being nonviolent, don't come out here. So at a sit-in in Woolworth in downtown Atlanta, she was heckled by a number of people that were there who did not want these Black young students. She was a student at Spelman at the time, who did not want them there. And so she was heckled by these people who pulled on her hair, who sprayed her with bug spray and other things before the police were called, and she was arrested for the first time. She was arrested multiple times. She ended up spending time at the Atlanta prison farm as well as the Atlanta Fulton jail, which I later found out one of my other women who was also arrested there, not at the same time, they would call it the Fulton Arms, because it was one of the newer jails, and so it wasn't as bad as some of the others, so the Fulton Arms. And I actually have some pictures from some letters where they would address things, sending each other from jail to jail. So she was in jail in Atlanta, I'm thinking through A. Lenora Tate Magavani, and she was sending messages to other friends and colleagues and comrades who were in jail in South Carolina, and they're addressing this to the Atlanta Fulton Arms. So as she was arrested, Bessie Smith Selloway still has today some of the receipts that her mother and her pastor would come and put money on her account so that she could get toothpaste and other things. She was proud of the fact that she was doing something that was going to bring about change. And she would describe how they got out early. She says, they said it was for good behavior, but we know it was because the media was starting to pick up and they didn't want to have that type of thing happening. Bessie, Rose, my mother, and others were committed to doing the work of justice. I'm sure that many of you actually probably know some people from this time period that may also have been doing some of this work. And I encourage, in almost every space that I'm in, I encourage you to go and have the conversations with these people before we lose them. For a lot of my work, I was chasing the clock, hoping to get to these stories and these women and these narratives before they passed. And as of right now, a number of the women that I did this work with, they are no longer with us. What's my total time, Michelle?
If you'll just allow 10 minutes for Q&A.
Okay.
So.
All right, that's
it's
good.
5:30.
I'm good. That's all I need. Thank you. All right, so I want to talk for a moment through some of these, some of the virtues that I was noting before. So I mentioned that freedom faith is the first of the virtue ethics that I lift up. And so I take the language of freedom faith from Prathia Lynn Hall, who grew up in the Northeast. So she grows up in the Philadelphia area. She's a daughter of a pastor. She was committed to nonviolence and a number of other justice issues as a high schooler. And she wanted to actually get involved and go down to the South. She was doing some test cases in the Northeast, all the way into the Maryland Eastern Shore area. But her dad said, absolutely not, you cannot go south. Unfortunately, her dad died early. And as soon as that was over, she said, I'm going. And so she becomes an active leader within the Southwest Georgia portion of the movement. So think through Albany and those areas. As she's there, she begins having these conversations with the people. And she says, the local people had wisdom of the ages. They had lived in this system of brutal racial injustice all of their lives and for their generations past. How had they done that? They had done that because each generation had passed on to the next generation this thing that I call freedom faith. This sense that I'm not an N-word, I'm not a gal, I'm not a boy, I'm God's child. And as God's child, that means that I am everything that I'm supposed to be. It may cost my job, it may cost my life, but I want to be free and I want my children to be free. So I'm going down to the courthouse and I'm going to sign my name and I'm going to trust God to take me there and I'm going to trust God to bring me back. That's courage, that's faith, that's freedom faith. Freedom was always the goal. And so as I was working with the women, hearing that language pop up, this quote, once I found it, actually encapsulated so much of what that was. Their desire for freedom since being on the soils of this land has always been the goal. But their faith was always enacted as a part of making sure that that was going to become a reality. I want to just keep moving because as I look at the time, I want to give as much time for Q&A as possible. And so I want to also note that this freedom was evident among the Black women, men, and children from the period of enslavement through our current moment. And so drawing from apocalyptic and Exodus biblical narratives with liberators such as Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner and even Harriet Tubman as the new Moses, freedom was always the goal. If you think about it, you know maybe some of the songs. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me, and before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. In the prayers of the people, you hear this crying out in the midnight hour that God would move in and have a way of actually helping them. So the next area or the next virtue is courageous resistance. So just for a second, I want to talk about this idea of cultivating courage. Courage is something that is not just automatically going to be there at full steam. It's something that can be built, that can be strengthened. And when I was talking earlier about how somebody would see something happen and it would encourage others, this is the cultivation of courage. This quote actually comes from Maya Angelou, who very often we know as the poet. Some might know as an actress. A few might know as a singer and a dancer. Not as many know her as the activist. She was actually in charge of the northern portion of the Southern Christian Leadership Congress. That was an official role that she played. A few of us who traveled together in Ghana were also able to hear when I talked through Pan-Africanism and the Civil Rights Movement about her experiences on the continent of Africa. But I draw this quote because it helps us to understand how courage as a virtue can be cultivated. She says, I realize that one isn't born with courage, one develops it. And you develop it by doing small, courageous things. In the same way, one wouldn't set out to pick up a 100-pound bag of rice. If that was one's aim, the person would be advised to pick up a 5-pound bag, and then a 10-pound, and then a 20-pound, and so forth, until one builds up enough muscle to actually pick up 100 pounds. And that's the same way with courage. You develop courage by doing courageous things, small things, but things that cost you some exertion, mental, and I suppose spiritual exertion. So this cultivation of courage was happening within community. As one person would do a small task, have the ability of saying, they didn't get me, I didn't die, I'm going to try again, right? Or seeing somebody else doing something and that then encouraging them to keep going. The third of those virtues is theo-moral imagination. And so we have moral imagination as a concept primarily within philosophical areas. I have developed this language around theo-moral imagination, this idea that even within this visioning that many of the women had, it was not simply of their own. These were visions that God was giving them, and they understood it as such. In philosophy, moral imagination can be understood as the presumed mental capacity to create or use ideas, images, and metaphors not derived from moral principles or immediate observation to discern moral truths or to develop moral responses. I perceive theo-moral imagination to be along a spectrum of sight, imagination, and vision, where what you see gives you the ground from which to imagine more or something different than that imagined reality then allows you to construct a vision by which to obtain it. So there's a liminal space that begins to happen where you're not quite in this area yet, but God has given you a vision of something that you're not quite sure of. But you begin to take the next steps to make that a reality. And so this theomoral imagination shows up in one example for one of the moral exemplars that I left that's not as well known. She was in the Laurel, Mississippi area. Her name was Berta Spinks. And the story is told by, let me hop back and see if I can grab her real quick. Gwendolyn Zahara Simmons, who was also a student at Spelman College, but she left and became the project leader in Laurel, Mississippi. And she describes they were actually in the Hattiesburg area. They were supposed to be in Laurel. They had no resources. They were going down for Freedom Summer, so this is taking place in 1964. She goes and knocks on this woman's door, Miss Berta Spinks. She's there in her jeans. She was young, like this. Zahara Simmons was there. Gwendolyn at the time. Gwen was there at the time. Was there in her jeans. She had her big afro. She knocks on the door, and she's not quite sure what the woman is going to say or do. And the woman opens up the door and says, "Are you one of those freedom riders?" Now, technically, she wasn't. And she wasn't quite sure if she should say yes or no, but she says, "Well, yes, I'm part of that kind of movement." And she said, "Come on in. I've been waiting for you my entire life." How is it that she knew that someone would come, that God would answer those prayers, that it would show up in this way if not for theomoral imagination? So those are the three major virtues that I lift up within the book: freedom, faith, courageous resistance, theomoral imagination. And then I move into, as I noted, a theology for movements. But I'm going to pause here so that I can take any questions that this might have generated for you. I know a number of you actually already have the book, so if anybody has already been reading it and you've got some questions, I'm happy to hop into those. And if there are questions that are popping in from online, if you have a question, please go ahead and put that in the chat and it will be brought into the space. Questions, comments? Oh, there's a mic somewhere too. Should we do this? There are hands in the back and here and here.
Thank you very much for your research and for the talk this evening. And I'm thinking about churchwomen, this idea of socio-religious activism, and we're very familiar with the role of the church. You talked a little bit about the role of schools, universities, young people in that. Were there other institutions that played similar roles in the civil rights movement that we don't hear as much about? I'm thinking fraternities and sororities, the Masons, the Eastern Stars, or is it really church and school?
Yeah,
okay.
It's kind of sort of not as much. And I say that because a couple of those things that you just lifted up had spaces too. So for example, many Masonic halls would have possibly been spaces for meetings, but we find very few that were happening there. Some of the women that I interviewed would say, well, we would try to go, but they wouldn't let us meet there. And I want to just note, and I try to say this almost every time that I'm sharing about this, there were a lot of people who were just afraid, and rightfully so. Your house could be burned, your church could be burned. If you opened up the doors of your space, you know, they open up the doors of your house, they open up the doors of your business, open up the doors of your organization. They could quickly call the mortgage on it and say it's due tomorrow if you didn't fully own it. Right? They could pull the insurance from it and then burn it down. All of those things were reality. So a lot of people actually didn't. I've never seen numbers over 20-something% of participants during the movement. So this myth, well, we need to be like in the civil rights movement when everybody was together. Everybody was never together. Right? Those schools, there was some differences that were happening there too, even within the black schools, even within HBCUs. And so one of the other moral exemplars that I lift up was the president of Bennett. And so as the sort of sister all-women's college, sister to Spelman, because many of the women that I interviewed were from Spelman, but some were also from Bennett, their president, Willoughby Player, took on different types of stances than the president at Spelman. Right? And so it varied from place to place. She was extremely supportive. She saw the arresting, she saw the protesting, she saw the time in jail as a part of their liberal arts education. and described it as such. She said, we're teaching them about politics, we're teaching them about history, we're teaching them about all of this. This is a part of their education. So much so that she would have her teachers go to the jail, take the assignments, and make sure that their students stayed on track. She actually wrote messages to the parents of those who had been arrested saying, they're in jail, we know it, they're fine. Right? That's a different mindset than the ones, so Gwendolyn Zahara Simmons gets kicked out of Spelman for her protesting because it was not recognized in the same way. So there aren't any organizations that were great at it, but what I'm thankful for are the few who took the risk to actually do whatever it was, because that's how we get what we have today.
Thank you.
No, thank you for the question. I saw Hunter's hand and then Ron's hand.
Thank you, Dr. Mingo, for this book. It's a real gift. I'm about a third of the way through, and I'm really excited because it's exciting my moral imagination, thinking about, in public theology, a cameo serves as a testimony. It allows people to imagine themselves in new ways. And so this is just such a powerful, how did you come upon, was it via your ethnography, your ethnographic background, or how did you come upon the cameo? Because I think that is such a powerful, it's a powerful part of your book, but it's such a powerful methodology to activate a whole new generation.
Yeah, so this idea, and thank you so much for the question, Dr. Rasaw, Dr. Farrell, for these questions. This idea that I was trying to describe earlier around the everyday woman was really important to me. Really important that I did not only look at people that we already knew, because I want other people to perhaps see themselves in it. I also had to fight as I was doing the research to be able to use the people's actual names. IRB would have me try to use a pseudonym. I fought for them to opt out versus opt in, right? So I plan to use your name unless you tell me no. Because they were already not known. Why would I erase them again? Right? It was really important for me to name just regular people so that we don't think that it's only the big names that give us access to the things that we can do that can bring about change. And so within that, also as I was describing earlier, I knew that I was chasing the clock. I mean, some of them were older. When I first started talking to Nana Rosa, the one I call Nana Rosa, she was already in her 80s. I didn't know how much more time. So even though I didn't know what I would do with the work, I did a small digital recorder that literally could fit in my pocket. I kept that on the table as I was recording. I took a small camera about this size that I also could put in my pocket. I initially went with camcorders, all of this stuff, but that's bulky. I would spend 2 months at a time living in New York City, staying in Harlem, moving as the women would move. And so by having those things much smaller, I could record at any time. And so I also have video of all of the women that I interviewed. So it's not just these small little snippets, but at some point, and I've actually done a small documentary, Hearing Her Story, where I'm able to feature some of these women because it's important for us to see them. It's important for us to know them by name. It's important for somebody to read and say, oh, I know that church. I know Miss Bessie who now, by the way, Miss Bessie now goes to Ebenezer, and she's still there pretty much every Sunday. But to know those people and to see them as accessible, which is also one of the reasons I tried to write the book in an accessible way, because I don't want them to just think, there's an image, I might know a little something. This book can be passed to almost anybody, I would hope, and they would get the depth of the history, but also have the encouragement to do something in the present. Next, and then next, and then next. Ron, we've got people online, so we want to make sure they can hear.
This is extraordinary ethnographic stuff and wonderful. And thank you so much for doing this work. One of the things that I wanted to raise is, where are we now in this, as society has changed so much, and the internet, the cyberspace influences? You expressed how you were influenced by not only your mother's story, but the people that she knew and so forth. When you cited the reference of someone saying, don't get involved in that, that was the lesson I got from my family when I was going off to college. Don't get involved in that kind of thing. The point is that so much of who you are now was what your elders set before you and how they engaged you, and they modeled for you what it looks like, and so that you can grow into it and produce this. I wonder if children these days are as accessible, have that accessibility to that, particularly in the reduced role of churches in family life and intergenerational connections where there may be elders around if they are, but the children are engaged on their cell phones. What does this bode in terms of the ethical challenges we face in public spaces when there's a significant rise in suppressing the kind of information that you're sharing now? So a return to the past.
Okay, so there were 15 questions within Dr. Peter's question. I'm going to take a few of them. I'll start towards the end, actually, because I am from Florida, for those who don't know, a state where many things are being banned in the current moment. But much of what I know as a person who studies Black history, I learned in my church growing up. Well before that, we already knew we had to sustain and supplement, always. And so I would compete in Black poetry contests and Black history contests and Black brain bowls. I was reading, my students in the ethics class that I have to teach at 6:30 were reading Martin Luther King's Why We Can't Wait last week. I read that as a child in my church, right? We weren't waiting for someone to say, you don't have access anymore, so now try to figure out something. That was always supplemented. That's something that we can continue to do now. And I do talk a little bit about the contemporary moment in the 5th chapter of the book, which is where I work through the movement for Black lives. So I take those same virtues and apply them in our contemporary moment. And I use contemporary, as I call them, movement pastors in a sense. So the Tracy Blackmans, the Leslie Callahans, the Karen Alexanders, the Pamela Lightseys. And I look at what they were doing in the midst of Ferguson and other spaces to see what application can look like. And that's also in a context where the Black church isn't as central as it once was, right? So it shows you that we still can do some of this stuff. One of the other things that I often wonder, and your next question will be over there, Bobby, or unless there's one online, okay. One of the things that I often also get concerned about when I hear questions around what about the young people today, is that whatever it is that they are going through, whatever it is that they know and understand, it's all on our watch. If they don't know it, that's on us. If they do know it, it's also on us. But figuring out a way to develop things so that they can learn, which is why I wanted to write this book. Literally, my godson has a copy of this book. My goddaughter has a copy of this book. It's also dedicated to them, but I don't have children, so my godchildren got the great shout outs. But I wrote it in a way that they could understand it, and also that Miss Bessie could understand it. But it's also University of Illinois Press, so it's got the rigor, but it's accessible because I want people to be able to use this going forward. I'd love for this to be a part of Bible studies. I'd love for this to be a part of, community readings, but all of this stuff, right? It's there. So that's the hope. What do we have online?
Real quick one from online from Libby. You mentioned doing this research over quite a period of time. I'm grateful for your dedication. How long did it take you to research and write in total?
Way too long, Livy, according to some. And I say that with a little bit of jest because it did take a while to get this book to where it is. And some of that for me was because I had to switch voices. This started as a dissertation project. What the book was one chapter in the dissertation that I saw as the crux of the work that needed to go out, and I needed to then rewrite it in a way that it could be accessible, but it could go even deeper. And so within the research portion of it, the primary research portion of it, that took me a couple of years, which is also why it took me felt like forever to finish the PhD. But as a scholar and as an ethicist and as a Black woman, I wanted to make sure that I didn't go into the communities where I was trying to research and simply take something out, which is why I described I would go to Harlem and live there for 2 months at a time. I did that multiple times. Then I would fly back up for other events so that I was a part of the community, not simply a researcher to take, but one who was learning and growing and experiencing things with them. So it took quite a while, but I'm thankful because I love the end product. I love the result. And I think that I've done my best to do the women who shared their story so generously with me, to do them well, so that what they sacrificed is not for naught, but it actually gives us what we need to try to go forward.
The other day, they passed a ban in England for anyone under 25 to get trans care. I look at the Roe v. Wade decision, which a couple weeks and then seemed to blow over. And then I look at BLM, which maybe a month. And then I think about your 381-day bus boycott. Do you think it's even possible in today's day and age to be able to generate that kind of movement anymore?
It's up to us. Anything's possible. Hope is another one of the critical things that I could have used as a virtue. Anything is possible if we decide to make it so. So I don't want to ever say no. Do we have some different types of challenges? Yes. Will we ever have 100%? No. Which is why I was specific in saying I've never seen more than 20%. So instead of focusing in on the 80 that don't show up, that don't commit, that can't do 381 days, focus on the 20% who can. And allow that to be enough to move the needle, because that's really all that it takes. So it's up to us to make it so.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Can we get one last question? Her hand was up before. Okay. As the chimes go off.
I don't have a question. I just want to say thank you for your energy. You research with your head, but you speak with your heart. And there's so much life in what you have to say. And we all need to catch that energy and use it all over the place. I'm going to school board meetings right now to get Angel of Greenwood in my district. It needs to be read by every youth in this county, in this country, and parents too. There is so much to do, and imagination is key.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody who was able to make it. For extending this opportunity to be able to share about the work. For those of you who are online, you can also go to AnneMarieMingo.com/books to find out more information about this book, to find spaces and places where you can order it. You can find it anywhere online at this point. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Mingo. Let's give her another round of applause. Thank you to those who are online. Thanks for attending this with us. For those of you who are here, feel free to have refreshments and linger a little bit and talk among yourselves. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.